Okay. Uh, Julia Mossbridge, how are you?
Eric Smith, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I do have a
Awesome.
problem, however. Um, when I talk to people in sales meetings, what they say in sales meetings is often different than what they say a year after the projects have been executed. And I think a lot of it is because they're being sold linear, automatic, um, uh, uh, packaged solutions that are made to look linear and automatic. Later, we find out that that wasn't the case. And as you and I know, that when you're doing intelligence and strategy, the linear path isn't always the one to take,
Or
and
maybe ever.
maybe it's never the one to take.
Yeah,
And that's a hard thing to message at the beginning of a sales cycle.
right. It
Uh,
doesn't really work for a PowerPoint.
that's
It'd be
right.
like if you show all the slides at once and then take away some and then add some random ones and then say there.
And I'm curious too because often when I talk to really good decision makers, they're very intuitive. So I'm curious, like maybe you can start with your background a bit and why you know some things about this,
Yeah.
and then I'm curious what your solutions might be.
Okay, so I'm going to dig deeper into the problem in a second, but first I'll sort of briefly describe my background. So, um, for about the past 15 years, my training's in cognitive neuroscience and experimental psychology. Uh, and I shouldn't say but, I guess, and for the last 15 years, I've been digging deep on time and our relationship to time. So, as human beings, we have this perception of time and we have this feeling that the future is unpredictable and that the only way to sort of make something happen in the future is to push from the past. Um, Meanwhile, physics is undergoing a revolution and philosophy of time is undergoing also a revolution in which there's an understanding that perhaps you could do things like pull from the future or predict future events, not in a way that has to do with extrapolating from the past, but actually has to do with getting information that leaks back in time from the future. And this all in my research anyway, I was studying the intuition of that. So what kinds of people are really good at picking up on future events that are actually not predictable based on the past? What kinds of tasks and strategies can people use to get better at that? How can I train people to get better at that? And I've called this in trainings for intelligence people whole mind foresight. So whole mind meaning your system one, your intuitive system that has been called very biased and emotional, which yes, it is, but there's good reasons for that. Combined with your system two, your rational, sort of explanatory, linear, uh, not not as smart thinking, and but important, um, but not as fast and actually not as insightful as system one thinking, but necessary. And so these two pieces, how do they play off of each other? So that's what I've been studying and talking with people in the intelligence world about, and talking with friends and family, or frankly anyone who will listen.
It reminds me of I think it's really neat, and you jumped straight to the cutting edge stuff, which is awesome. No build up. I think it reminds me of when they do the speed dating studies. And they're just like, we're going to compare you on 1,000 different dimensions, and you rate each other, and then you decide how much you like each other. Um, After a couple of dimensions, people just give up on that and they go with looks.
Well,
So in a
yeah,
way,
because
like
that's
Tinder,
intuitive.
yeah, it's intuitive, or it's looks. Maybe they're saying looks, but they're catching,
Well,
a
looks
whole lot of
catches
correlations.
everything. So it's like well, there was this great study about what the unconscious mind could do in terms of decision making compared to the conscious mind. And so it was this phone experiment. There's two cell phones, and there was an advertisement for cell phones. And so they were cell phones that didn't exist in the real world, but they were just advertising these. And here are the features. And there's this phone has four bad features that basically everyone agrees sucks, like doesn't work underground or whatever it is, right? Or can't call your aunt. And then this one has four good features, like works everywhere and it's pretty cheap. And then people read those features and great, and then give them a break. Okay, 2 minute break where they just do whatever, drink water, come back, and then they go, okay, new features, four here and four here. They're both the same, like both equally good and bad, equally the same. And then they ask them, one group, to deliberate, think logically. Which phone would you really want? If you want to maximize you know, your ability to get a really positive product that helps your life and you want to save money, which phone are you going to take? And the other group is just like, here, do this cognitive tasks that we're going to try to exhaust your rationality on. And then at the last minute, like, oh, just pick a phone. The people who did the cognitive task, who were just ignored the question, didn't deliberate, they correctly chose the one that actually had the good features before the break. The people who the people who sat there and deliberated, which one should I choose? I want to make the right choice. They only paid attention to the information after the break. They were about equal. They completely forgot the past information. And that matches with the capacity of your unconscious thought process, which is much broader and has parallel processing and is much faster. It's like a really fast computer. It's like a supercomputer compared to your system one, or more rational and conscious process, which is necessarily slower, serial. It can really only deal with 4 things at a time. So while they are both necessary, I feel like we need to kind of acknowledge that we have this giant supercomputer that is absolutely evolutionarily activated based on looks, based on the sound of someone's voice. We don't know what that's telling us, but it's telling us something that 4 factors on some kind of spreadsheet are not going to touch.
So this is the spidey sense, but it's not necessarily
Psychic.
emotion. It's information being blended together
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't feel like you got to it in a legitimate way.
It feels illegitimate because our conscious minds have this opinion that anything that they don't understand is actually crazy or wrong. But it's like the stupid computer says, I don't understand calculus. And you're like, right, because you're only programmed to deal with, you know, addition and subtraction. And it says, well, then calculus must be stupid. Right?
Right.
How is
Surely,
calculus helpful?
so surely though, so you've got all this information that you can't deal with except for unconsciously.
Yeah.
But we also have this process for isolating variables, focusing on them rigorously, um, checking our own biases and so on.
Which is
Where does that
necessary. Yeah.
where does that come in?
Yeah, right. And so this is key. So the reason I keep saying, you know, system 1 is like your smart, fast thing, and system 2 is slow and stupid, but you need them both, is because you really do need them both. So if everything were up to system 1, you wouldn't have any sort of, first of all, you wouldn't have any conscious experience. So that's a big difference. Human beings, animals, we have conscious experience of what's going on. What does that conscious experience allow us to do? So system 2 is much more conscious and tells the story, sort of the story of our lives, even if it's not accurately reflecting what happened in terms of a third person point of view, if they were looking at the firing in our brain. But the story of our lives is represented by this system 2, this supposedly more rational system that is taking the information from system 1 and filtering it down to like a pinpoint. Why do you need that? Because in order to feel like you matter, in order to feel like you have agency, you have to understand something. In order to understand something consciously, it has to be very constrained. So we could either not feel like we have agency and not feel like we have experience and understand a bunch more, but just not consciously, which we're doing all the time anyway. Or we can have this experience of agency and get things down to a pinpoint. So given that people are this other way, where we have this sort of understanding that's at a pinpoint of the full information, when you're dealing with, for instance, sales, you know, obviously I'm more of a scientist person, but I think about problems like this, right? If you're dealing with marketing, you're dealing with sales, you're dealing with another human being who also has to have everything into this pinpoint. At the same time, if they don't feel intuitively that that pinpoint contains this breadth of information back here that no one's even talking about, but that has to be represented, they're going to feel disconnected and like they don't get your thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you need both. So really, system 2 to me is about reaching someone else.
I like that. And yeah, maybe that's why people fall back on the hair and teeth things with politicians. You get overwhelmed with information
Yeah.
But I really like this idea that knowing what we know about the conscious and the unconscious mind, it would be unreasonable to rely solely on reason, like explicit formal operations. And I think a lot of CEOs get that, and they've got the lateral mobility to go with their guts in a lot of ways. But I think everyone else has to front load the reason, or if you want to have an initiative
Yeah.
approved, you almost need to have the answer before you start and be able to show how you're going to get there. And I think that's just an incentive structure that's baked into a lot of organizations. And I know, Steve Jobs had a lot of foibles, but that was one thing I think he was really good at, was just like, go build something.
Mm-hmm.
And he put the individual contributors in positions where they were able to go build something instead of having to go through layers of explanation before they were allowed to build something.
Right.
Do you think that's on the right track of
Yeah.
of, of how do you solve it?
Yeah. If you want to stifle innovation, make everyone explain everything ahead of time. Right? Because now every little small stupid computer has to convince every other small stupid computer, but you're not talking about this big thing, this genius thing that we all have behind us that is actually producing the insight, right? And so flipping it over and doing a Steve Jobs approach. I'm not saying he was the best manager, but like this is a useful management tool to say, look, you have inside of you these gifts. You have inside of you these insights, and you may not be conscious of them, and that's okay. And they may come out in a hair and teeth sort of way. I don't know why I like this one better than this one, but I strongly like this one better than this one. And maybe you go with that because the I don't know why really represents thousands and thousands of computations that are actually legitimate. That doesn't mean you don't have to check for bias, because it could also represent thousands of computations that are trained on information in the world, in our culture, that's biased. So that's a really nice reason to talk to someone else. So that's why I say system 2 is about connecting with someone else. You say to them, so I really strongly like this. Part of it I understand, and I think it has to do with this. Part of it I don't understand, and it just feels good in my tummy. And what do you think? Is there bias here? Is there, using each other as checks, like loving, compassionate checks for bias and for insight, is really the wave of the future, right? We work together, even when we're working with AIs as collaborators, right? Saying to an AI, this is what I think is true. Does this make sense to you? And the AI says, I don't know. What about this? And no one really trusts anyone else to the extent that you just go with what they're saying, but you're working it out and you're improving it with the acknowledgement that you don't understand it all.
I think that gets at what we were talking about just before, where people like to watch videos, but I think even more when I talk to sales folks, they say it's all about the call. Like you can do all the marketing to warm your leads, but it's all about the call. And I like this idea that getting to that intuitive feeling is about interactivity. It's partly trust. It's partly like, are you solving the problem? But a lot of it is just being able to reflect back and forth. So maybe that's the solution, is just like live. And then you mentioned AI. So uh, Feynman, when he was talking about AI a long time ago, he would talk about it in terms of it's great for brute forcing things that have finite solution spaces and so on.
That's because that's how AI was then. I mean, AI was
Right.
about that.
And now it almost looks like it can replicate some of that pattern recognition for us. But do you think that because our supercomputers are already really good at that pattern recognition, is AI should we be leaning on AI tools here, or should we be leaning on them in the linear thinking domain?
Well, yeah. So the history of AI really clearly shows like there was the expert systems world, and the basically a bunch of if-then statements world, right? Where like the Deep Blue, what was the IBM computer that won the Deep Blue competition, right? That Deep Blue is the IBM computer. Yeah.
Deep Blue, yeah.
Yeah. That was, I believe, an expert system that was all about solving one problem, right? So it was both narrow AI and it was this expert system approach. And then we sort of got into these perceptrons and these neural nets. And I mean, for decades. And then finally, there's an explosion of using those in deep learning, where we're basically imitating first the visual system, and then kind of all of the unconscious mind, all of the sort of, although I would argue missing some really important parts, but kind of the human unconscious pattern recognition system. And then we're like putting on top, like a cherry on the top, putting this sort of rational, like, oh, right, we have to explain to the other computer what we're doing. Now, I think that we should absolutely lean on this incredible replication of the human unconscious mind and the pattern recognition system when it's appropriate. Like, you know, I don't know any human being, regardless of how amazing they are, that can figure out the protein folding pattern of a protein
Right.
given a DNA strand. That's not a savant syndrome that I'm aware of, although maybe it exists. But there are AI deep learning systems that could do that. So let's do that, right? And when we do things like try to jam this front end onto it so it acts more like a human because it has this like simple interface, like with ChatGPT, to me, the only use for that is to communicate with it. But to me, it falls flat. Like you really still can. I mean, maybe in the future it won't, but right now, if someone writes something with ChatGPT being the actual sort of author, it sounds like there's nothing behind it. It sounds like it's just the front end, but you can't hear the sort of humanness behind it because it doesn't exist. And so it's copying a bunch of other people's front ends, a bunch of other people's system two explanations, and then it's spitting it out at you.
Yeah.
That feels like a waste. Like, why use it for that? So yeah, I guess I sort of have a mix of responses depending on how the whole AI
Yeah. I
development
don't know where to
goes.
land on it either. Like, I feel similar to how I feel about robotics, where there's these things that robots can do in the world, uh, and they can be put in the form factor that fits the task or the situation the best, but then they make it look like a humanoid.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't, like, why would being a humanoid be the interface for the world?
Well, but that's
Um,
the thing, is it helps us give the right directions and have the right relationship. I mean, it really is true that like even when I mean, this gets into metaphysical stuff, but when religions tried to solve the problem of relating to God, it worked a lot better to say God is just like a person, kind of
yeah,
invisible, right? Because that's really all we know how to do in terms of relating. So I get it. I get the need for humanoid form factor, but I also think like Japanese robots are often non-humanoid, and
hmm
I think there's good reasons for that too. And it kind of can remind the user, this thing is different from me, and I have to actually think about how it doesn't know about me. So you start to see it as more of a student. I think it would be very helpful for us to start seeing AIs as more of a student of humanity.
hmm
And I think it would help if their form factor were different. But I also understand the desire to make something that we already know how to, or we think we already know how to deal with.
yeah. When I, yeah, I get that it's about how we interact with it. It's not about the robot, but also Pixar, if nothing else, they've shown that you can get people to empathize with anything, like a
Oh,
toaster or a fish, those sorts of things. So I think if you do it right,
even
um,
Wilson in Castaway. I mean, it doesn't even have to be
right.
right. I mean, it could be a volleyball. People
There's
want to relate.
what's that?
People want to relate.
Yeah, yeah. So I think maybe we can do half of that equation from our side.
Yeah.
Anyway, like when I read the stuff from like Steve Pinker on generative AI, and I think he makes a good point that it doesn't have causal knowledge of anything outside of the token limits that the information that you feed it for this problem. So I can't remember the name. I think it's called the Linda problem or something, where you say Linda is alive at 10 a.m. and she's alive at 2 p.m. Was she alive at noon?
It doesn't
And
know.
it'll be
Yeah.
like, oh, probably because it's like looking at probabilities and patterns rather than causal knowledge. And I wonder if that's a good analog to how we are thinking about how the unconscious mind works. It's a little bit fuzzier. And now I'm talking about things I don't know about, so I'm hoping you jump in.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it is. I think that the unconscious mind is actually more accurate. Like the unconscious mind is a more accurate reflection of physical reality. And it's a step between physical reality, sort of as served by the receptor sheet and multiple sensory signals. It's an interface between physical reality and what it's going to serve up as like, here's the story. And the story that we tell is, if I was alive this morning and I'm alive now, I was alive in between. But actually, we have no evidence of that. Like,
Right. It's true.
so that's the story we tell. And I think that, so that's an example of the unconscious mind sort of showing itself as the producer of this, if you want to call it simulation, but it's a story that we need to survive about what's going on. And it's inaccurate in about 1,000 ways, more than 1,000 ways, but it's actually great for our survival.
So it sounds like a potential solution to my problem is
Yeah, let's go back to that.
you have cold outreach. That's the problem, right? Which has to be linear in a way. It's solution oriented, and here's how we get there. But the outcome of that is phone call. And that maybe that email has all the rhetorical tricks that establish your ethos and your pathos and your logos and so on. And you get them to the phone call, and the phone call is where you can expect to have like a shared unveiling of one another's unconsciousnesses.
So I disagree. I think you start before. I think you don't do the cold outreach. I think you use your intuition, this massive parallel computer, and trust it to take a list of 1,000 potential clients down to 10. That you're like, you read through the names and you're like, okay, ping, ping, ping. You get your list of 10, and then you deep dive into those. You really understand those. So you spend your time understanding those, so that by the time you write the email, it's a unique email for each one. You've really looked at them. You really have a good vibe. So I don't think you ever do cold outreach.
That's interesting. So instead of the numbers game of like, I hope I get 2% conversions from this 1,000 emails,
right?
It's very targeted. Now I'm going to ask you, where in that list of names, where does your unconscious get the information to develop that vibe if you're just looking at a list of names?
So, your rational mind would like to know that, but your rational mind doesn't get to understand that. So the rational mind just has a fantasy that if it thinks hard enough, it can figure all that out. The problem is it doesn't have the resources. It's really working with a low resource serial processing situation. So what a name can tell you, for instance, and putting psychic stuff aside, because I also think it could get information from the future about how successful you'll be, and you don't have to know how that works, but it kind of does. But putting that aside, even just looking at a name, we have seen many, many, many names of organizations, and we've seen which organizations thrive and which organizations don't, and which organizations match kind of our values and which don't, and which organizations might be interested in us and which aren't. And that's all being processed unconsciously. So names that are of that type might give you a ping. You don't know why, but there's some kind of pattern matching going on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, in the past, this kind of worked. Oh, that sort of sounds like that. Or I have some unconscious association between that and this other organization. So you don't have, so the great thing about all of this is you can waste your time trying to figure it all out and train the stupid computer in calculus, which it's never going to be able to learn because it doesn't have those skills. Or you could just let the smart computer do the calculus and try it and see, because it's such a better use of time in my experience.
It'd be neat if the feedback were more immediate and more frequent. Like when we talk about biofeedback, where it's like, I'm going to bias this random number generator to make ones instead of zeros. You're getting 1 million points of feedback every second.
Right, but you have to extend your time horizon. I mean, like, that's really good practice just for emotional maturity and for productivity, is we sort of want this immediate feedback because, again, our rational mind is questioning everything constantly.
Yeah.
But what's great for learning new things is like, well, we'll find out in a week, we'll find out in 2 weeks. So you're invested in each one. So now it's emotionally important to you rather than not being really invested.
Okay. And if time doesn't have an arrow, it's all compressed, whether you're getting 1 million points of feedback or 1 point of feedback every hour.
Yeah, that's the psychic stuff. So that's the precognition stuff where you're actually getting information from the future, regardless of when it is. So that's feedback too.
And is there evidence that, in your opinion, is there good evidence that time does have an arrow? Because whenever I hear, people talk about it in terms of entropy, but if you're trying to observe entropy, you still have to assume that time has an arrow and that causality accompanies it. So I haven't found a good explanation that makes me feel very secure that time is moving forward.
Yeah, well, as you point out, and as I've pointed out and other people have pointed out, the second law of thermodynamics, where we're talking about entropy,
Mm.
is circular, right? You can't actually, people use it to describe time's arrow or to define time's arrow, but it is in fact a circular description of how things change, right?
Right.
If you think about it, like maybe longer than 15 minutes, you notice that, right? And so, or maybe immediately, but so I don't have any evidence I can't show you any evidence that time is going in one direction. In fact, I think there's good evidence that time is symmetric at least. But our unconscious minds and our conscious minds, our system ones and our system twos are picking up on different aspects. So our system two builds a forward story. Our unconscious minds, I think, are much more agnostic about when things are happening.
Yeah. And I guess that it's a very circular explanation and one that makes our conscious minds feel good. But also, well, okay, here comes another circular explanation, but evolution has led us to a point at which we have conscious minds that perceive time going forward, presumably because it's adaptive. And if it's adaptive, that means it reflects something in nature that's real. Now,
Oh, no, not true. I
okay,
agree with everything except for the last statement.
okay,
So adaptive things don't have to reflect things that are true. They just have to be adaptive. So Donald Hoffman's work on the interface theory of perception at UC Irvine, he's the guy to look at for this because he says, look, he actually creates agent. He does agent-based modeling. He's a computational neuro guy, I guess you could call him. And he says, look, I create dumb agents. I create smart agents. The smart agents spend their energy trying to replicate exactly the environment and in some kind of way so that you have basically a mirror image of the environment in the experience of the rabbit or whatever it is, so the agent. The dumb agents basically replicate the important pieces of the environment, but in ways that are not accurately representative of the environment. So for instance, if water and food are always co-located, it'll just represent water and food doesn't even exist.
got it, right. It's like a
Right?
regression analysis. Like, whoops, where'd my other variable go? That's the same
Right.
thing.
Oh, it's collinear, right? So,
Okay.
so what he finds is that the stupid bunnies win always. They outcompete because they're not spending all this energy trying to actually represent what's going on. And I think that's why we have the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. The conscious mind is a great story about what we need to know to survive. But what really reflects what's happening out there is this bridge between physical reality and our conscious experience.
Okay. So it only needs to be adaptive to the extent that it doesn't have to be correct. It just has to get us to reproductive age. And the ability to get us to a 2 or 3 year old that can take care of itself ish or be raised by wolves.
Yeah, and it's actually more expensive to be correct.
Right. And that reminds me of like the Roomba stuff.
You mean that little
Where
robot?
the little robot, which
Yeah,
just goes around in circles. It's a dumb agent. Is that how
yeah,
you would describe a dumb
yeah.
agent?
Dumb
It
agent's like,
doesn't know what the room looks like.
but it gets the job done.
What's the guy's name? Rodney
I don't know.
Brooks at MIT who designed that thing? Anyway,
I don't know. But it comes back to this thing about causal knowledge. I am very curious. I think that we think we have causal knowledge. I'm not sure we actually have causal knowledge either. So I think that causal knowledge might be this fabrication of system two to try to simply explain the output of system one. So I think might be a rationalization.
mm-hmm. Well, that would make sense with everything I've seen on the internet from people thinking they're like leading with facts, but they're actually just confirming their own biases.
And who isn't? Like,
Right.
I don't know how to do it otherwise. We're all trying to reach back and talk to each other's unconscious parts by this small mouthpiece.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's a flawed instrument, but useful. So
it's
let's
awesome.
how do we
It's
make
like
it?
quite awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, flawed and amazing. So how do we make it useful? And let's go to the example of
The cold calls?
Yeah. Okay. How do I decide who I'm going to cold call? I want to cold call 10 people.
Right. So it's training. You're training yourself to trust your unconscious mind. So you have a list of 1,000 people. You're looking at a spreadsheet. In fact, Eric, you told me a story about 10 years ago about doing intelligence like this, seeing headlines and just picking
Mm.
in seconds. Like, oh, we're going to look at that one. No, we're going to, and that worked really well, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Right. So it's the same thing. So you're going down your list. You're not actually thinking, oh, well, this person has that many people working for them and this is their history. You're just looking at the names. You look at something that seems irrelevant, but that is linked to all the other information.
Yeah.
Or even
I
look
think of
at
it as,
logos, even looking at logos.
rather than signal detection, the way we always approached it was pruning. So you can't do intelligence on the whole world.
Right.
You have to pick a direction or a few directions, but and the more rapidly you can prune away bad directions,
Yep.
the better. And then you get to that point, and then that's where a lot of people start, and they feel like that 1% that's left is the 100%, and
Right.
now they're going to do rational thinking. But they had that's what experience is, right?
Yeah.
They develop these visual patterns. I say visual; it's not necessarily like I see things
You develop
visually,
all
but
sorts of patterns. I mean, basically, you're developing biases that help you.
yeah.
And
And those
experts can be
biases are
wrong.
almost always correct, but like
Well,
you wouldn't, let's say you cross the street because somebody menacing is walking towards you and you're in a bad neighborhood.
yeah.
Maybe they're the CEO of Merrill Lynch and you just missed an opportunity. So being able to
Yeah.
not get um, those type uh, type one errors,
Yeah.
uh,
Both
that's
of them. We're trying to avoid both type 1 and type 2 errors. And this is confusing because system 1, system 2, unless you're a total nerd, it's confusing to also talk about type
right.
1 and type 2 errors. So I think of it, the story I used to tell my students when I was teaching statistics is um, I thought this guy who was another graduate student was in love with me. We went out for like a picnic, and I said, I really have all these feelings for you. And he looked at me and he said, type 1 error.
It's false alarm.
It was fantastic. It's a false alarm. Like
Yeah,
you're making that up in your head and it's not true. And it was such an adorable thing to say. I forgave him immediately. But type 2 error is where you miss something
right.
that you should have gotten.
And that's a false negative.
False negative. And
So it
so,
depends on what the costs are, right? Like
yep,
in a lot of scenarios, getting a false negative carries almost zero cost.
right.
But in cold calling, a false negative can be really costly if you're missing somebody who's really strong.
I think we actually underappreciate the cost of a false negative. We want it
Okay.
to be that we're just looking for the signal, but in fact, we're also looking for the not signal.
And then we
Uh,
just forget them very
yeah.
rapidly.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a learning process, right? So you have to convince yourself that it works. So you have to like, maybe if you're in a large organization, you break off your sales team to a group of people who are like, hey, do you think you're kind of intuitive? Try this new approach for the next month,
Mhm.
and you just kind of see how it goes. I think that is the way for people to learn that this can actually work. It doesn't, it's in an organization like CIA or something where you're doing governmental intelligence about really important foreign events, it's harder to convince people to say like, hey, take a month and we're going to do this intuitive thing over here.
Right.
But I think there's ways to do it too where the costs are really high. You just have to make sure that your system too understands what the output is, how it's going to affect, like, so if you make some kind of decision based on this intuition and you're aware that it's based on intuition and you don't understand, what your system two needs to do is not necessarily understand the decision or the information or the conclusion, but to understand the impact of it, right?
Okay.
Because that's really the costs that we're looking at.
And let's move away from my problem into, our
What
client's
is my
problem. So
problem?
yeah, my problem's solved now. I got it. No, it's really interesting. And I think it's something I think everybody does. And then when it works, they forget that it works because they can't explain that it worked very well. But let's say, so we have intelligence clients where we're delivering these intelligence briefings. My mantra has always been, you want intelligence to be more than information. It should be pivoted against the client's landscape, where they
Yeah,
sit in the landscape, where their aspirations are, what their competitors are doing, what their stakeholder space looks like. what their, social media graphs look like.
It should include
But
foresight. It should include foresight and insight, I would say. Yeah, too.
but if we're asking clients to be intuitive about how they use intelligence, would it be better to present them the raw intelligence uh, rapidly and frequently rather than, at the end of every week, we're going to distill it and take a perspective on it?
It would be better to speak directly from system one to system one. So like that's why I like the idea of making custom games. So every day or every week there's just a game where this information comes up. Did you ever see Severance
I
on
don't think
Apple
so.
TV? Okay, it's this
No.
weird show, and one of the things these people are doing, they don't really understand what they're doing, but these numbers drip down the screen, and their job is to put them into bins according to how they feel. They don't know what the numbers represent at all. And so they're sort of like a model of the human conscious mind, right? Trying to manage information from the unconscious. I think it would be great to make games where people are in this new state where they're not working and they're getting the raw intelligence and they're kind of matching it with some conclusions. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can imagine a game where here's a list of, you know, raw intelligence, some of which you didn't actually put into your conclusion as the analyst, but some you did. Um, and then conclusions or insights, and have them just rapid fire, give them 5 seconds, match, 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 match. And
Mm-hmm.
over time, they're going to learn how to do that, how to match those
And,
up.
and as the master of this game, how do you decide which conclude? It's almost like when they test people's lie detection ability. They, have people purposely lie versus purposely tell the truth,
Right.
but they're not really being deceptive because they're being told to say these things in a way.
Right.
Like
So
as
it
the
doesn't
game
really
master,
match. Right.
yeah.
Right.
How do you run that game?
As the game master,
Yeah.
you run the game assuming that there is no right answer. So what they're doing is they're gaining insight by matching these, and you don't know what the answer is either.
Mm.
But over time, they're going to become better at it. They're over time, it's like you could become better at, like, so for instance, when I was at graduate school way back in the day, I was training people to get better at hearing the differences between these sounds that I
Right.
couldn't hear the difference between, because you had to be really, you had to do it every day for like an hour, and I wasn't going to do that, but I was going to see if they could do that.
Right.
And so um, they could, but they didn't know how they did it. They just were asked to do the task. So you're training system one. You're just saying, do this task over and over again. It's like the chicken sexing thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just learn to sex a chick. This is female, that's male, that's female. After
Let's
thousands, you get it.
let's explain that
Oh
really
yeah, right,
quickly.
right. In the
uh,
beginning of the, you want to go? Yeah, you go.
Okay, so basically, there's these people who are paid quite a bit of money to tell you whether your chicks are male or female because it's not obvious which one they are when they're chicks, and there's not a rubric that you
Right.
use. It's just based on looking at the chick, uh, and then later finding out whether it turned out to be a male or female chick, and they get really really good at doing this. And the same thing. Do you remember Antonio Gisbert at Northwestern? He
He
was
sounds
doing
familiar, but I don't remember. What was he doing?
snowflake categorization, and I didn't even believe him that this was a thing because he studied implicit learning.
Yeah,
And then he just showed me how it all worked. It's like you have no idea what makes this snowflake category A versus category B because it's so complex.
yeah.
Anyway, but you get good at sorting them. Is
Right,
that a
just like
good?
an AI, just like a deep learning algorithm, a self learning, an unsupervised deep learning algorithm will do that exact same thing,
Yeah.
and it's a good imitation of this process. And so you're giving the data, and you're saying, you sort this, you get good at this. I don't know how you're going to get good at this. I don't even know what the
Right.
answer is, but you're going to start doing this, and that brings this rational and the what we call the non-rational, or really just differently rational or differently thinking minds
So
together.
it sounds like, not only do we need to deliver good intelligence deliverables that are not only accurate, but insightful and contextualized and reflected off of things we know about the world that are outside of this one bit of knowledge. Uh, we also need to do some training of the consumer of intelligence to figure out how to use it.
There's multiple games that I will think of a game every minute for this, but I really think it's important because eventually what you're doing is you're training people to think intuitively and to think critically at the same time.
Could you imagine if schools had something like this instead of training it out of people,
Yes.
train it
Train it in.
into people? So it's not
Yes.
just the total misfits who become very intuitive.
Yes.
Like everybody was able to do it.
Yes. I think of it as I don't know if you ever saw that Star Trek one where they're in the pits on the Vulcan planet. The kids are in these pits. I don't know. I'm a Star Trek fan. Okay, I'm a Trekkie. So there are these pits where people have these video screens around them, but they're all kids, and they're like they learn at their own rate. You know, one video, but they're learning simultaneously. So one is like math, and then history, and then they're answering questions back and forth. And just the process of having to do that really quickly is clearly training, at least in my mind, their intuitive capacities.
Here's the trouble. When I think of it, I can trace the science back and know that it's all true, but my rational mind doesn't believe it, no matter how much I know it, which is really, really tricky. And I don't think I'll ever overcome that. So maybe there's some sort of an opening exercise that needs to
Yeah.
happen before somebody goes into one of these games in
Yeah.
order to prepare their minds for reawakening to
Yeah.
things that they know.
It's a lot of, thank you, reawakening to things that they know. It's a lot of trust. It's really a relationship. It's really like you have these two parts inside of you. And if your relationship so far has been like, look, you're going to tell me stuff and I'm not going to believe you because I don't understand it. If that's the relationship, it takes some time to say, you know what? We have to work together here. Like we're actually best when we're working together. And that's an internal relationship that you can, I don't know, there's stories you can tell, there's activities you can do to try to get that open. Meditation is one of those things. But there's also eye gazing things. There's all sorts of, you know, Jedi mind tricks you can do to try to get that going.
I think this sounds like an essential component of an intelligence offering, like to be able to receive the intelligence and use it in a useful way. And I'm kind of it would be neat if it came with something like a headband that tells you you're in alpha or theta brainwaves and stuff like that. I don't think that those sorts of things are necessary, but maybe it creates the bridge that allows your rational mind to say, "Oh, science, brainwaves, that sort of thing." To have this
We could. I
headband,
mean, we could get like a Muse headband and see if people are in theta, which is a good place to do this kind of the theta or in alpha, but then changing to gamma. We could do that. It's a lot. It's an added layer that I think
yeah,
I would love to just strip people of because it's kind of like putting a middle person. I'll say middle person, not middleman, in where you don't need one.
yeah, that's been my feeling too. I think if we
Yeah.
can overcome the resistance in other ways,
Yeah.
that's better.
Yeah.
But it's not a product. Products are a lot easier to sell than services. In a
That'll
well,
change. That'll change. I don't know. I think
the
that's
scale,
changing. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's actually, I think one of the things that when people talk about scaling and they say, oh, well, products scale more, actually, we've forgotten that anything that's one-on-one scales.
Well, that's it, right? Though there's a distribution of people who are going to be really good at offering this sort of a service, and you're at the top end of that distribution.
Yeah.
If we were going to need 100 more
Yeah.
people like you to sell something, I would say we'd struggle to find people who are able to do it.
Right. So then we make the games.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we make a video of me and you talking to what? It's like what we're doing right now.
Oh, so meta, Julia. We should name their company that. Hey, I think, okay, here's what I think. You can tell me what you think too. I think we just post this whole video as an archive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we'll just we'll take a 3-minute teaser
Yeah.
and lead people to this because I think it is, as people keep telling me, compelling content is what we need to be doing. So I love it. What do you think?
I agree, but you have to choose the teaser because if I choose the teaser, it'll be like this long philosophical explanation. And so you have to choose. I think you have a better sense of like balance in terms of reaching people.
We'll see. I'll ask Andrea Beckner. She's the smartest person I know with this sort of thing. What she
Excellent.
thinks. I'm
Good.
plugging her right now so that she'll do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Um, don't know. I guess there's a part of me that says, well, I guess I do have a very quick question that is actually totally a long question, maybe another conversation, but maybe it's a teaser for another conversation, which is, um, do organizations like ours, like Tangible IQ, do they need to exist in the future? If people are actually trained to do this themselves, do we put ourselves out of a job, and is that kind of good? I mean, I just wonder.
I hope so, because I don't like doing anything longer than 5 years anyway.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So if we haven't put ourselves out of a job in 5 years, then I'll be disappointed. And it's not like there's a dearth of new problems and interesting directions. So, and I think if you learn how to think, um, and if you learn how to combine different modes of thinking, like there's always a market for people to solve those issues. So, but I like that. Like, I hope we put ourselves out of business, or at least put ourselves out of this product.
Yeah,
Um, and if it triggers a renaissance in how people use intelligence, and that just becomes the way things are done, then it's not like, it's not like people don't know who AT&T is, right? Or like Pac Bell or something. Like, that goes down in history as the people who cracked the nut. And I'm not even actually really that concerned with going down in history. So, um, I don't see it as an issue. Do you?
not at all. I think that I would like to be as at first as indispensable as the word the, and then later we just drop the article.
Absolutely. I love that. That's so cool. That's how do you remember Jun Kim
Yes, I do. I
the
love
photos?
June. Yes.
He would always say that. He's like, I wish I could just disappear
Yeah.
into the science.
Yeah.
I was like, oh man, I love that. Like, that guy's a remarkable
Yeah. He
character.
was like transcendent thinker. Like
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't his sense of self was diffuse.
Oh, he didn't want to put his name on papers. They had
Yeah.
to like twist his arm for it. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, okay. This has been really nice. I appreciate you taking the time, and you shoot me the video, and I'll pick some bits out.
Awesome. This is really fun, Eric. Great idea. I think this is much more fun than a blog. So
Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. Like, it's always a pleasure just to talk to you. Like, what am I ask you to write something and I'll read it? That's stupid. Nobody reads.
no,
Read.
oh,
Uh,
secretly.
I'll see you later, Julia.
All right, take care.